Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins, and we're continuing to record on Wednesday morning. Well, guess what? School is back. Yes, we've had the summer off, but race class is back, and we are excited to have Jonathan Feingold joining us. But before Jonathan actually begins instructing us on race class, I thought I would do something a little bit snarky. And you know how a lot of those MAGA states are now putting the 10 Commandments up on the wall of classrooms? Well, I decided, wait a minute. They shouldn't be putting up the 10 Commandments. They should be putting up what Trump has been teaching America. After all, this is their great dear leader, and we should all be learning from them. So what has Trump taught America's children? Okay, this is my suggestion as opposed to the 10 Commandments. Here's what he's taught us. Mocking the disabled is cool. Never apologize. Never admit you're wrong. Name calling is really cool. Science, however, is stupid. Empathy is for losers. Be afraid of anyone not white, Jonathan. Cheating is totally acceptable. Bullying people is good. Stealing from charities is, okay. What? Reading, what a waste of time. And attacking dead people is actually fine. And distorting the truth is normal. And my final one, always take credit when no credit is due. So I just think that instead of the 10 Commandments, I'm going to make this recommendation because after all, they follow their leader. Well, follow him where he's teaching them. And of course, if I told you that, you wouldn't want them in your classroom. So we started race class in January of 2022, Jonathan Feingold. I went back and found the old press release. And the old press release from back in 2022 began this way. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and Arnie Arnesen are offering a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And as you pointed out at the very end of the press release, you said, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. So you've had the summer off, Jonathan, but thank you so much for joining me. And I can't believe it's 2025 and things have gotten so much worse. And it's not because of us, it's because of Trump. But welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Arnie. It's nice to be here. I would not describe my summer as having been off.
I'm sure.
Given that, every front that we're facing right now was only escalating over the summer. But I will say that I've missed our conversations. It's nice to be able to drop in and connect with you. Today literally was the first day of school for my 6-year-old. So we dropped him off in Somerville Public Schools for his first day of first grade. And so it's for a lot of parents, for a lot of caregivers around the country, it's that time when you are handing your kid off to people that you're entrusting to, keep them safe, help them grow, help them learn. And one thing that is really, I think, critical to understand is that one of the primary, so there's a number, but one of the primary objectives of the Trump regime is to defund and dismantle the public education system that we have in this country. In part because, it's, very far from perfect, but it is one of the few places where we actually invest in everyone. Mm-hmm. It's quite radical if you think about the fact that we have a system that guarantees that every child in the country is able to attend a school where they're going to get taken care of and where the point is actually to invest in ourselves. Now, you see places like Florida where there's been, and a really nice article recently from Jennifer Berkshire that describes how, like, one of the aims of the Trump administration through voucher policy, through education savings accounts, through all the sort of fear mongering about public schools, is to actually undermine public education writ large and turn it into what she and Jack Schneider would refer to as sort of a la carte education, which is individualized, off the shelf, and where there is no community. And really, parents are on their own to try to cobble something together. That's, a little bit of an aside, though, in a sense.
No, it's not,
Not
because when you think about it, what the objective is to resegregate school. So, we knew that we wanted to sort of bring everyone together, and that the concept of the white school and the white bubbler and the white this, that wasn't something that, and that public education was going to be a place, as you point out, where everybody was invited in, that everybody was given an opportunity to learn. And I'm just going to share something with you. So my daughter is teaching in an elementary school in Vermont, and Vermont is kind of like the Norway of America. Okay, so it's very open and progressive and very protective of their public schools. And but of course, the whole anti-woke DEI stuff is still in the atmosphere, all right? And you know that. So I was with her, and I've told my audience this story, Jonathan. I'm with her last weekend, and we're getting together her library for her 3rd and 4th grade classroom, okay? And we're going through all the books, and we're categorizing them. And she picks up one of the poetry books, Jonathan, and she knows that there are a couple of parents that are very MAGA in her classroom. She was sort of warned ahead of time. And one of the poetry books shows a young black poet on the cover. And she looked at it and she said, "Mom," and I said, "Yes, you have a poetry book in your hand. Put it back." And she goes, "No, I know that, Mom. I know that, Mom. I just want to be prepared because I have a concern that a parent will react." And I said, "Well, parents react all the time. It doesn't mean that their reaction is right." All right. And this is in liberal Vermont, in a school system that embraces as much of the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion as possible. But it doesn't matter because everybody is feeling the weight of what Donald Trump is doing because it's such a universal assault, Jonathan.
So it is universal assault, and I think, and it is accurate that one of the Trump regime's goals is to resegregate the United States. Victor Ray had a really nice piece out on this earlier in the spring. But there is also a very sort of economic grift dimension to this. And the attack on public schools is partly cultural. It's trying to sort of break the infrastructure to cultivate an inclusive society, but it's also profit driven. It's a desire to steer public money away from schools into sort of for-profit entities that then will quote unquote deliver education in a way that is permissive of all sorts of forms of discrimination. In the same way that every other quote unquote sort of market driven system does not serve everyone because it's not intended to. If you take the billions of dollars that we today and for decades have invested in, again, a far from perfect public education system, and then privatize it, part of the point is so that Trump's friends can make money. And so DeSantis's bros down in Florida can make money, and in all sorts of problematic ways. So what I think, so we're back. And since our last episode, which was in May or June, I think probably May. And now we have, I think it's very safe to say that the country has tipped from, the risk of fascism into fascism. I don't think you can really argue with that. You have a sort of leader, as you say, who it's very unclear that there's any of the institutions that are meant to be a check are acting as a check. Certainly not Congress, certainly not the courts. It's an open invitation to use force in order to, kidnap people on the streets, in order to intimidate political opponents, in order to arrest, in order to, do all the things that, if this were not happening on U.S. soil, we would be, it's a pretty dangerous place, wouldn't want to be there. And so, and as you said, all sorts of attacks on what I think of as racial literacy. just the information and sort of concepts and skills necessary to be able to understand how these phenomena that we sort of think of as race and racism, how they manifest, how they operate, and how they even affect our perceptions of the world. Attacks on all of that. And so my sense is for us, I think part of the goal is to zoom out a little bit and to, in a sense, annotate what is happening. Because I think there's just so much coming at us so fast, designed to overwhelm us, that maybe it's helpful for us in these conversations we have take a little, half step back and just sort of describe what is happening so that it's easier to sort of follow and understand. And so for today, what I'm hoping to talk about a bit is to sort of respond to this question. So we know that the Trump administration is openly, like unapologetically racist in all sorts of ways. And so the question I want to ask and respond to is, so for the Trump regime, is racism the ends, like the end goal, or is it means to an end? So is, the sort of Stephen Miller sort of white nationalist sort of worldview, is the goal to get there, or is racism sort of the racial tropes used to dehumanize, undocumented people in the United States, or to suggest that black people like do not deserve to be in sort of positions of power? Is that sort of mobilizing race strategically in order to get to some other place? So the question is, so with Trump regime and all its fascist sort of politics, is race the means or the end? So that's my pitch for you, Arnie. I think that's what we should take today.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think you can't separate the two. And there's a great article, Jonathan. I just got to read the opening statement. It's at salon.com. Okay. And in a lot of ways, it goes a little bit to what you were suggesting. And the title of the piece was Trump's assault on the Smithsonian is a crime against history. He's not just whitewashing museums. It's a full-on project of white racial erasure. Okay, so in a lot of ways, the means and the ends, all right? And he quotes W.E.B. Du Bois, and he quotes from his landmark essay, The Souls of White Folk. And I think this is part of it too, is that it's not only to sort of use racism as an effective tool, but it's also to elevate what is it that we value and what is it that we don't value. And this is what he writes. The assumption that of all the hues of God, whiteness alone is inherently and obviously better than brownness or tan leads to curious acts, wrote Du Bois. How easy then, by emphasis and omission, to make children believe that every great soul the world ever saw was a white man's soul, that every great thought the world ever knew was a white man's thought, that every great deed the world ever did was a white man's deed, that every great dream the world ever sang was a white man's dream. So yes, the means and the ends, but I'm trying to figure out what is his end. For Donald Trump, ends always are power and money. That's his only end. Okay, he doesn't care how he gets there, but that's really what feeds him. Now the question is, how is he using this card to feed that end?
So you'd be a great law student, Arnie, because almost always the question is phrased as, either or, when the answer is both. And so clearly, right now, and I think that sometimes it's probably a mistake to overemphasize Trump, just one sort of unitary figure, right, where he, in all sorts of ways, he is a pawn. He's a pawn of Putin. He's a pawn of the Heritage Foundation. He's a pawn of the Federalist Society. He's this megalomaniac, sort of buffoonish guy who wields a lot of power, in part because, he has this base around him that he's able to move effectively. But the sort of the project of the Trump regime certainly is one where the goal is to and resegregate, I think, there's ways in which it actually sort of underdescribes what the goal is. But the goal is to re-entrench and legitimize a racially ordered society in which, as a function of sort of one's racial identity, you are either presumed superior or inferior.
Correct.
And that then you accrue all sorts of formal and informal benefits from that. And so Du Bois also, one of his sort of foundational pieces, he also talks about how um, one of the benefits of whiteness has always been the psychological benefits of it. The psychological wages of whiteness is that even if you are sort of living an economically precarious life, you know that you're not going to be stopped on the street. You know that you're going to have sort of the benefit of the doubt because you are white, and really because you are not black. And so part of the goal of the Trump administration is to sort of normalize a society in which whiteness is on top. But there's also ways in which race is being deployed in strategic ways to further both that end, but then also sort of the broader fascist project, and including the grift. And so if you think about the effort to privatize education, which is designed in part to enrich, folks who we don't even know exist, but who benefit from systems that move public money sort of out of the sort of public sphere into private hands. And one of the ways that you do that is through the sort of divisive politics that use race to discredit and use racism to discredit policies that benefit everyone, like public education, or like welfare, or like healthcare for all, often through the production of sort of racial tropes or scapegoats in order to discredit this system that we actually all benefit from, and then sort of defund it. And so there's pieces to both of this, and all of that connects to the Trump administration's assault on our basic ability to understand our own racial history and how race continues to function today in U.S. Society.
So let me ask a question. As I was reading from that essay by Du Bois, do you know what kept coming back to me? The doll experiment. And you know the famous doll experiment where a little black child and a little white child are looking at dolls. And there are white dolls and there are black dolls. And they're told to pick up the good doll. And both the black child and the white child pick up the white doll. Okay? So it's not only feeding to poor whites that they won't be stopped on the street because they have the privilege of being white or they're white. It's also reinforcing for people of color that they are lesser as well. So that it's I go back to that doll story over and over again, because what was drummed into that little black girl's head was that the white doll was better. So it wasn't just that there was a sense of superiority or I deserve it because I'm white. It's what was reinforced for her. And that's the other piece that we don't always talk about. We talk about this idea of, well, I can walk down the street and not be stopped. But then again, if you're a person of color, the assumption is I will be stopped. And it almost becomes acceptable. But it's not, Jonathan.
Well, so there's actually interesting ways in which developmental child psychologists have sort of questioned some of the ways in which we think about the doll study. And so a colleague of mine, Vinay Harpalani, has a nice piece on this. But one of the so if you think about sort of the erection of white supremacist monuments, and one of the things that the Trump administration is doing now is they are pushing back into the public sphere monuments that communicate public meaning, that we as a society, because that's what the public monument is, communicating societal values, we adhere to values that sort of endorse white supremacist beliefs. And what that does is, even if it doesn't sort of internally or like subjectively within a person sort of inform how they think about, themselves or others. It communicates what the society values and who it values. And
Yes.
so with respect to, for instance, the Trump administration's deployment of masked thugs who do not identify themselves and to kidnap people on the street and who are openly racial profiling people who fit some sort of Latino, quote unquote, undocumented immigrant description, what that does societally is it stigmatizes a particular sort of identity and suggests that you presumptively are a non-belonger. And we do not actually have to adhere to the rules and the procedures and the laws that we say matter when it comes to terrorizing you. And that communicates something to everyone. And so you also think about in Jim Crow regimes, like the goal wasn't to wholly separate people so you didn't come into contact. It was actually to make very clear through public symbols who was on top and who was on the bottom by sort of just all these um, just institutionalized indignities. Like you having to sit on the back or you not being allowed to enter this door is publicly conveying that in this society, in this community, there are certain people who are more human, more deserving than others. And
Yeah.
part of what the Trump administration is doing is trying to sort of reintegrate that. But also, like, the key to this is part of the work that the Trump administration is doing is trying to undermine our ability to understand the Trump administration's racism by preventing students from, kindergarten up through graduate schools from learning the truth and basic concepts about the source of racial inequality in the country. And so if you look at the Trump administration's attack on the Smithsonian,
Yeah.
one of the things that the Trump administration said was inappropriate, was improper, was this notion that race is quote unquote socially constructed. We've had a bunch of conversations about, just
Yes,
like
we have.
international boundaries, just like currency. This thing we call race is essentially a human invention. The Trump administration is doubling down on the notion that race is biological. And so you might say, why? Why? Like, what's that have to do with the broader project? And one of the things that it has to do with is that we do live in a society in which there remains massive racial inequality, in part because, as we've discussed, all the problems that pre-existed the Civil Rights Act in the mid 20th century never were remedied.
Never.
And so we all sorts of ways in which, even if well intended, reproduce the world that we have. Now, if you believe that a race is biological and you see racial inequality, then the theory that you're able to communicate to the world is that, oh, you know what, it turns out there might be inequality, but that's just the way the world is naturally ordered. Because people are in these different groups that happen to be based on, their genes, and some are just, have it and others don't. The Trump administration, I think, is sort of a lesson in sort of the myth of meritocracy. But the reason why the Trump administration, why it's a threat to the Heritage Foundation, to the Trump regime, to Stephen Miller, for students to be exposed to the notion that race is socially constructed, is then it delegitimizes racial inequality. And it turns out that all of these disparities, whether it's racial, whether it's based on gender, whether it's something else, is actually the product of things that we do as a society that, in effect, treat communities differently than one another. And this playbook that the Trump regime is using now to prevent all of us from being able to understand the world that we live in. It is, in many respects, an attack on literacy. It's an attack on just our ability to understand society and to imagine a better one. And there's some real clear precedent to these sorts of policies. Do you want to know where I'm jumping back to for the precedent?
Where?
18th century South Carolina. Derek Black, legal, one of the sort of leading education law scholars in the country, wrote this recent book on sort of the ongoing assault on Black education, Black learning, and he traces it to enslavers in the 18th century in South Carolina, as one example, imposing anti-literacy laws. Because what became very clear is that one of the biggest threats to a system of legalized racial domination was literacy.
And so that's where we are today with the assault on public education. I need to let you go. I am so glad you're back. I'm so glad that we're talking this way. Not only did I miss you, but we need to constantly probe what it is that we are talking about, what it is that they are afraid that we are talking about. And I'm again going to end, Jonathan, that you write, we know race matters. Part of this project, this thing we call race class, is to make sense of what that means. Thank you so much for doing this, and we will be talking in a month. I appreciate you, Jonathan Feingold.
Thanks, Arnie. Good to see you.
Good to see you. This, everyone, is Race Class, the Thursday edition of The Attitude. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.